Okay. Morning, everybody. I'm calling this meeting of the Public Safety Communications Task Force to order. It is 11:18 on July 19th, 2023, and I am Barbara Neal. As a reminder, we're going to record this meeting. Callie has started the recording, and that recording will be posted on the webpage following the meeting. So let's start with a roll call of task force members. I can see all of you, but I will just acknowledge that you're here. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning.
Morning, Michael Wright.
Morning.
Ron Kumitz. Good morning.
Morning.
And Mayor Dunges.
Good morning.
Excellent. And I just want to see, is Jim Mack on the line? Okay. So Jim Mack's not present, Kelly. And neither, of course, is Commissioner Morrison. She's not able to be with us today because of the ongoing recovery efforts. I'll also point out that also present, of course, is Callie Audette, who's doing our administrative support for this task force, and Tucker Jones, who is from the Department of Public Safety legal team. So welcome, Tucker. And it looks like we have a few members of the public. Philip Sisk is with us. Philip, do you want to introduce yourself and your affiliation?
Yes, good morning. Philip Sisk. I am with Mission Critical Partners. We are a public safety consulting firm. And I am reaching out to you from Providence, Rhode Island today. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be virtual.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. Kim Cheney.
Good morning. I'm a longtime member of the now apparently defunct Public Safety Authority in Barre and Montpelier, with an abiding interest in this problem.
Thank you for.
I look forward to hearing the discussion.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. Is there anybody else from the public who would like to introduce themselves?
Steve Whitaker, if you can hear me.
Yes, we can, Stephen. Good morning.
Hi.
Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to speak directly to Mayor Dunges and extend my personal condolences, those of the 911 board, and I'm certain those of this task force, to you, Mayor, and your community as you continue to grieve the tragic loss of Officer Ebbinghausen earlier this month. Our thoughts and sympathies are with you and your community. Okay, moving on then to approval of the agenda and or proposed changes to the agenda. I will say that I'm going to defer the conversation on the congressionally directed funding agenda item until the next meeting when Commissioner Morrison can be with us. This topic is very much in her wheelhouse and not so much in mine. And I feel it's appropriate to wait until she can be present to engage on that conversation. And also on the agenda item entitled Public Records Request Process, that will include our discussion of the draft confidentiality policy that was distributed to task force members yesterday. So do task force members have any other changes to the agenda? Okay, hearing none. Let's move on to approval of the June 28th, 2023 meeting minutes. So the meeting, or the minutes rather, from the June 28th meeting were distributed to task force members last week, which actually I think means the week before last at this point, and are also available on the task force webpage. Is there a motion to approve the draft minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Okay, the motion by Ron and the second by Paul. Thank you. Is there any discussion? Okay, all in favor, say aye or raise a hand. Yeah.
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the minutes are approved. You all set with that,
Hey.
Kelly? As far as, okay.
Hey, Barb, could I ask somebody to email me that draft confidentiality policy so I could read it leading up to that discussion?
You should have
Steve Whitaker
received it.
here.
Yes, Stephen, you should have received it from me this morning, just a little while ago.
Oh, I will look. Thanks.
Okay, so as mentioned, the next agenda item, congressionally directed funds discussion, is deferred until the next meeting. So let's move on to public records request process. So we being Commissioner Morrison and I consulted with both the Department of Public Safety legal team, as well as the 911 board's legal counsel, and have confirmed that it's within the task force authority to require all public records requests be referred first to the co-chairs and then processed using the existing procedures already in place at the Department of Public Safety. So to address that topic and also incorporate that the earlier discussion we had about the possibility of non-disclosure agreements, the DPS legal team, again, in consultation with the board's legal counsel, created a draft confidentiality policy for your review, discussion, and ultimately approval, hopefully, via a vote today. So the draft policy was distributed yesterday to task force members. I'm assuming and hoping that you have had a chance to review that. Are there any questions or concerns or items to discuss about that policy from task force members? Paul?
Not necessarily a question about the policy, but just something that you just said. During our first meeting, Commissioner Morrison made a point to say that this task force is its own entity. It's not an extension of the Department of Public Safety. It's not an extension of the 911 board. So you just said a minute ago that we need to follow the policy of the Department of Public Safety when it comes to public records requests. And I'm not sure I agree with that.
Okay, I think the part that might be missing there and the assumption we're operating under, the commissioner and I, are that the legislative language said that the Department of Public Safety was to provide the administrative support for this task force. And part of that administrative support could certainly be the handling of public records requests, in my view.
Okay.
So that's sort of the thinking that got us to that.
I mean, I think that by virtue of the fact that our minutes and our records are all stored on a website that's maintained by the Department of Public Safety, that makes sense that DPS would provide the actual dissemination for us, but I still think that any request should come to this task force, or at least the chairs of this task force, for decision, not necessarily decided by DPS policy, but
Yes, I understand now what the finer point you're making here. So my understanding, and Tucker, you can jump in here if I am way off base, but my understanding in the reading of that confidentiality policy is that decisions about whether or not something is public or not public are left to the task force.
okay.
And they make that determination. In some cases, that would likely be in consultation with legal, because we do have to follow the public records law. But it comes to the task force first for that consideration.
Okay.
Am I on target, Tucker?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The task force as an entity in of itself. And, we tried to lay out kind of a process by which that those decisions get funneled to the chairs, and then the task force can make the determinations of whether to claim exemption in consultation with any other entity that may have an interest in the records. Like, for example, you may be receiving records from not just the Department of Public Safety, but other agencies and departments in the state. And there may be other interests that this group or we might not know of potential claims of exemptions for non-public information. So the attempt in the confidentiality policy is to create a process by which you can vet all of that. And then you have the support of the Department of Public Safety's public records team, as you need it to do that.
Great,
Okay,
thank you. All set on that point, Paul?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other comments, items for discussion from task force members on the confidentiality policy?
So the only thing that raised any concern in my eyes was Barb, were you involved at all, or were you aware of the process for the RFP for the Lifeline system that was done a number of years back, where the original vendor had done a system, and then the whole entire RFP was thrown out, and there was another one, and in the process there was a public records request, and the original vendor claimed that virtually everything was a trade secret, including the prices. I think that we as an entity need to be able to vet potential vendors' claims of trade secrets, because that, something like that is just absurd. What you're charging for something is not a trade secret.
I was not involved in that Lifeline procurement that you mentioned. My experience with the RFP process and procurement process through the 911 board has always been when those types of questions come up. If there is a concern, we consult with our legal counsel, make sure that we are in alignment or following, I guess more than in alignment with, we're following the Vermont Public Records Law. I would anticipate if we have those kinds of questions come up in this setting, we might also seek the legal consultation. Does that sort of answer your question?
It does. I mean, I think that we just need to be aware that just because a vendor says something is a trade secret doesn't really mean it's a trade secret, and be ready to address that.
Okay, so noted.
Barb, are you going to take public comment on this topic? Because this is near and dear to me.
Yes, I will allow public comment on this topic in a moment, once I know that all the task force members have had their questions or concerns or points considered. Is there any other task force member comment on this? Okay, Tucker?
I wonder if now is a good time to discuss the email portion of this.
Actually, good point, because I do have a note on mine that's what I wanted to comment on, and I just completely went by it on my notes. So sorry about that. I guess, and maybe you'll have more to add to this, Tucker, but on the section in the confidentiality policy that speaks about the use of vermont.gov or partner.at-vermont.gov email addresses, for those of you who don't already have a vermont.gov email address, we will be working on getting the partner email addresses set up immediately following this meeting, assuming adoption or approval rather of this confidentiality policy. So you would then get a notification about that email being set up and ready to go, and instructions on how to use it. So that was my comment. Tucker, do you have something further on that?
Yeah, I'll just kind of provide a little bit of the context. I think it's 4 task force members that may have municipal or other email addresses. And when we spoke with the Attorney General's office and ADS, there's a recommendation that task force records relating to task force business be disseminated on a approved email through vermont.gov or partner.vermont.gov email addresses, in large part because of this broader concept that this group may be receiving non-public information. And so the Agency for Digital Services can set up partner.vermont.gov email addresses and that would be the address that any materials relating to the task force would be sent for you. And it would be essentially a new email account that you would have a email address and a password, and that's what you'd have to log into to get the emails related to the task force. So it's somewhat burdensome to add something new, but that was the recommendation. So we added that in there that you would use that type of email to communicate about task force business.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments from task force members? Okay, Stephen, go ahead with your public comment on this topic.
Well, I just want to reiterate a point I made at the last meeting, is that the Department of Public Safety's legal team has stalled a records request for pre-regional dispatch work group SharePoint folder for more than 14 or 15 months now. So they in no way are capable of timely responses for records requests to this task force. I would encourage this task force to get its own legal counsel to advise and of the obligation of individual members of this task force to respond to public records requests at, for instance, Mayor Dunges or, select board member, select board chair White, or any of those people who are receiving emails or documents that are not exempt from public records under like a pending RFP, exemption or something, should be honoring public records requests and clearly can do it in a more timely manner than the department. So I totally object to the idea that you're in effect handing as a almost fait accompli this confidentiality agreement, which is inconsistent with public records law. And I can't even open the document that Barb didn't send me until this morning. I get an error code, and to get rid of the error message, I do see it in the background, but to get rid of the error message, it closes the document. So this is a very important issue, and the task force needs to make sure it doesn't derail or subvert this whole process by catering to the administration's unresponsive public records. I'll use as another example the governor's emergency communications, what's it called? GPAC, governor's emergency. Anyway, Barb Neal, your co-chair here, even refuses to provide the records of that emergency preparedness communications agendas and minutes. So this task force's work is so huge and so important that you really need to get this foundation level straight and not throw a wet blanket on the whole and frankly impugn the credibility of the process by adopting these kind of railroaded secrecy provisions that only the administration is promoting. None of the members have asked for this. So I'll leave it at that. I do need a copy to review thoroughly before the discussion and not as at the time of the meeting with a document that won't stay open on a smartphone. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Stephen. Kelly, could you forward a copy of the confidentiality policy draft to Stephen and see if it works better from your, when you send it?
I'd also ask for it to be tabled to a subsequent meeting because I won't have had time to review it while I'm listening on the same smartphone. Wi-Fi is down all over Montpelier City, et cetera. So.
Thank you for your comment, Stephen. I'm going to go back to task force members and see if we are ready for a motion. to approve the confidentiality policy? Paul?
Just in rereading it again, I mean, part of Stephen's point, I guess I agree that the Department of Public Safety is not the custodian of records, so DPS legal staff shouldn't be making decisions about what is released and what is not released. They should just be advising the task force. But then that leads me to my question is the proposed policy, paragraph number 1, second sentence says that the task force is the custodian of records. So that would imply that if the task force, and we all make up the task force, that would imply that the task force would have to vote on each individual records request in a majority rule. If there is some question as to whether or not something is public record that should be released, would that require a task force vote on every public records request? Since the task force as a whole is considered the
Right.
custodian?
So I would expect yes, unless the task force wants to direct the chairs to make that decision, perhaps at some point. It is very clear in this policy to me that the task force is the custodian of the records. But the overriding thing is we have to align with public records law, right? So it's not
Exactly. Right.
that, so the task force cannot decide that something is public if it is exempt from disclosure under the public records law. And that is where, at least in my opinion and my experience, it's really good to check with legal if there's any question on that. But I think that because DPS is supposed to be requiring the administrative support for this, the logical place to go is for DPS legal to consider that. Though I will point out that I have had ongoing conversations with the board's legal counsel from the Attorney General's office, and I'm aware that he has also been involved in the conversations, including to develop this policy. So, it's perhaps a little bit different than the typical framework for DPS legal involvement.
Well, with that said, I don't have any major problems with the proposed policy, and if it comes to a vote, I will support it. But I also would not be opposed. Stephen had asked that it be tabled till next meeting, and I don't see that we're going to be discussing anything confidential today. So if the majority wanted to table it till next meeting, I'm fine with that too. I can go either way.
Okay. What say you, task force?
I would tend to agree with Paul.
Okay. The one thing that I will just put out there for consideration is establishment of those partner.vermont.gov or whatever it is email addresses needs to precede the distribution of the draft RFP. And so the creation of those email addresses would come after the approval of a policy. So we're introducing, which may be fine, but I'm pointing out that we will be introducing a 1 week delay, if you will. But if that is the task force view, then I think we should have a motion and a vote to make that decision to defer. Tucker, do you have anything to add? You look like you wanted to say something.
No.
Okay.
I can ask if you want. I can see if ADS can get the ball rolling on creating those email accounts if you all would like, pending your continued review of this policy. So it's, kind of ready or in place for next week or whenever you meet next. If you all would like.
That may be a good idea, because my understanding from conversations with you, Tucker, earlier, and also ADS, that can take a few days. Their official turnaround time on that is 2 weeks, although I'm hopeful it could be expedited. And I think that may be possible. So I'd suggest if we want to defer the decision on the policy, that we at least go ahead and create those email addresses.
If, I hate to go backwards, but if punting this policy till the next meeting is going to result in another week or 2 week delay in the task force getting to see the draft RFP, then I guess I would want to move forward with it today.
Do we have a motion
So
for any of the
will-
above?
I will move that we adopt the confidentiality policy as presented to the task force on today's date.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Mike Dungus seconds it. Any further discussion?
I do have one thing, and I don't know if it's appropriate at this time or not, so please feel free to, tell me to be quiet if it doesn't fit. But, and I don't want to waste any dollars on this, but if there is, the opportunity or a conflict comes up when it comes to resolving what should and shouldn't be put to public, there are funds available for a third-party attorney to take a look at whether that public records request fits or not, correct?
I am thinking back to the legislative language. I don't know that I know the answer to that.
Okay.
I know that there are funds available for project managers and any other subject matter experts that the task force may need to complete its work, which maybe that could fall under, and I'm not quoting directly from the language. Tucker, are you familiar enough with that to offer a comment? I mean, I don't know the answer.
I'm not sure if the enabling legislation specifically, creates that pool of funds. I just don't know. But I note you raise an interesting point. So my name's Tucker Jones. I'm Assistant General Counsel at the Department of Public Safety. I'm a state employee. We try to help where we can, and we'll always do that. But in a stricter sense, my client is the commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, who happens to be the co-chair of this group. This group gets the administrative support of the Department of Public Safety. So you get any of the resources we have in the commissioner's office, et cetera. And so we try to help out. And then just separately, Barb Neal is the chair of the 911 board, who gets legal assistance. That board gets legal assistance, not this group, but that board gets legal assistance from the Attorney General's office. And so to this point, we've just collaboratively been working with the Attorney General's office to try to help out, essentially, Commissioner Morrison and Barb. So that's where things stand right now. And
Right.
It's a good question, because if there were some conflict, for example, Commissioner Morrison had a different interest or view than the group. In a strict sense, my client is the commissioner. And, we would certainly want to work through that, identify it early, and be transparent with this group of what interests we are conveying to the group. The enabling legislation said the administrative support, and the degree to which that includes legal advice and assistance is, perhaps open to some interpretation. So, we're just trying to work collaboratively at this point to help you all. But in one sense, the task force and the individual members of it are not strictly my client as an attorney. And we would want to resolve that early if the group had an issue or perceived an issue.
Sure. Do you mind if I follow that up real quick?
Nope, go ahead.
So I think I appreciate that, Tucker. I think that's actually a great place for us to be. It's nice that everybody's working together, and I actually don't foresee any potential conflicts, because I do think everybody has the best of intentions here. I think my thought process is, to Stephen's point, if there does become a conflict in deciding what can and can't be released for public viewing, having the opportunity to send that to an outside counsel, if there is that conflict, might be something we want to consider. It doesn't have to be in the policy, but definitely in our decision-making process as we move forward. That's just kind of what I was thinking.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm
Paul,
assuming that.
Paul, hold on, please.
Oh,
Oh, I'm
sorry.
sorry, Ron. I
I'm
didn't
sorry.
realize that was you. I saw Paul's hand first.
I'm sorry,
And-
Ron, go
and
ahead,
then-
Ron hasn't spoken. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I mean, if adopting the confidentiality policy is going to sort of hold up other things, is there any reason, if we adopt policy and then find in the future that there's a problem with it, we can't revisit it?
Correct.
I think that's well within the realm of possibility.
So then I would say that we should just, take a vote on adopting this and move forward. And if should it become a problem in the future, we can revisit it so that we don't put a speed bump in our own progress.
Okay, thank you. Paul, did you have, and I do see you, Kim, I'll call on you in 1 second. Paul, did you
Yeah,
have a further comment?
Yeah, I agree with Ron in that we can always revisit this policy later. But also at least a couple of us on this task force, if not more, have sat on previous, boards or groups to evaluate granting of awarding of grants, of reviewing all kinds of different proposals, and we've done it with our municipal email addresses. I'm not totally sure why this particular task force is requiring that we can only send and receive email communications using vermont.gov addresses, when I've sat on several others using my Barrytown municipal email address. I believe Michael has as well, using his. And so I'm just not sure why this particular task force has to be contained within the vermont.gov realm.
So my understanding of that in conversations with our legal counsel from the board is it's really kind of a best practice. But beyond that, I don't know much more of the
Okay.
reasoning behind that. Tucker, do you have anything you can add?
I was going to say the same thing. I've just heard it was the best practice, and I assume that it's because the state system is encrypted. And so communications within the state system are encrypted, but as soon as you send or receive something from outside, it's not. And that's a lay person's very vague assumption.
That makes perfect
Okay.
sense too, actually, because there are additional steps that need to be sent or need to be put in place to send emails securely outside of the state system. And if you have one of these addresses, those steps are not necessary, so things are more protected. Does that answer your question, Paul?
It does.
Kim Cheney, go ahead.
Thank you. As probably you know, in another life, I was a state attorney general. And I want to second the mayor and Mr. Jones' comment that this task force get independent counsel. I can tell you, just thinking of trying to coordinate municipalities and state and intermunicipalities is going to be a minefield of controversy. And it's not that the job can't be done, but it should be done independently. And I think Mr. Jones is absolutely right. And the mayor is good to bring it up. And certainly purchasing services, legal services, fall within the purview of the task force. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Anything else for under discussion on this from task force? So we have a motion, we have a second, and let's go to a vote. So I'm going to do a roll call, I think, this time, because it's hard for me to see who's voting where. So if we could, let's start with Ron Kumitz.
I would vote yes.
Okay, thank you. Michael Wright. I'm sorry, didn't,
Sorry, yes.
yes, okay, thank you. Jim Mack is not here. Mike Dungus,
Yes.
hey, Paul,
Yes.
and I vote yes as well. We have everybody covered, Callie? Okay, sounds like no one is opposed and no one is abstaining, correct? All right, the confidentiality policy is approved. So Callie, will you update that policy? There's a place to fill in the date that it was approved, remove the watermark and post it to the webpage, probably under resources or something. We might as well post it right up there.
Yes, I can do that.
Okay, and as we discussed, Tucker, I think you can go ahead and initiate that. Well, you will, yes, because the policy's been approved. I'm sorry, I got mixed up on where we were. So we'll initiate those email addresses that need to be created right after this meeting, and people can expect to see instructions coming on that. Great, excellent. Okay, so moving on to the next agenda item is the RFP status. So during the last meeting, there was some discussion about, there were concerns about some of the deadlines, some of the language in the legislation and reports that were due, particularly reports due in January of 2024 and what they were to contain. And so we, again, as the commissioner and I, went back to the chairs of the relevant committees at the legislature to get some clarification on what the intent is. And I can circulate the email if you'd like, but in a nutshell, the feedback we received is that the intent of the language is that there be one report in January of 2024, which provides a progress report on the data collection and analysis tasks outlined in the language, any pilot projects that might have been funded, and any information on the beginnings of the work for designing the system. So the way it was worded kind of made it look, at least to some readers, that we were going to have a preliminary design in January 2024. That is not their intent. The language or the intent, according to this correspondence, is that we report on the progress towards all of these tasks that are outlined in. There is no expectation that a system design will be anywhere near complete in January 2024. So with all of that feedback, we went back to the internal team that is kind of working on developing the core language of this RFP and adjusted it to make sure we were conveying that legislative intent to potential vendors. You know, the concern, as we discussed last time, was with these very tight timelines, we may not get any vendors to respond. So you will see that when you've had an opportunity to review the RFP. Are there any questions on that part of it, or anything else that folks would like me and or the commissioner to follow up on with the legislature at this point? Okay. Okay, so speaking of the RFP, that internal work of developing the core stuff in the shell of the RFP is essentially complete. Essentially complete. Was there a question? I'm sorry.
No, sorry. I apologize.
Okay. So the internal work is essentially complete on the RFP. Once those partner at Vermont.gov email addresses are established, we will be able to distribute that RFP to all task force members. I'm really hoping that we can get that process expedited. I'll put on my little squeaky wheel hat the best that I can, to see if we can get that really, moved quickly. My recommendation for, but we also want to give you adequate time, obviously, to review the RFP. So, my recommendation when it comes time to setting a next meeting will be that we set one for next week in the hopes that we can get that RFP circulated to you and we can at least begin a discussion on it, the content of it next week. If for some reason everything, falls off the rails, then we can always move the meeting to the following week. So then depending on the input, let me step back a little bit. The core of the content of the RFP right now is really based upon what the requirements are in the legislative language, right? These are things that we have been told we must do. And so we're going to get the subject matter expertise to come in here and do it for us efficiently and effectively. But there's also, so there may be some flexibility in how those things are worded, but we still need to get the work done. There's also room for, in the legislative language, for the task force, of course, to have input on what else might we want to be considering as we develop this plan or design for the public safety communication system. So when you are reading the RFP, be thinking about that, right? What else might we need to know? And then depending on input from the task force and any further work that might need to happen to fine tune the RFP, and assuming we get those email addresses set up quickly, we're targeting right now like a mid-August or August 9 or 10, actually, as the date for the task force to finalize and approve that RFP, if all of this comes together correctly, or as we're thinking. And then we would anticipate issuing that RFP very soon thereafter, that like it'll be ready to go. Then there's a 6-week turnaround time from whenever we issue the RFP to when we get the responses back. There are some questions and answer periods that are built in there for vendors to ask questions. That would put us on this timeline that I'm talking about right now at about September 20 for responses to be due, and then we'd begin the work of evaluating those responses. Once you pick a vendor, of course, you have contract negotiations, so you can just see where the timeline will extend out from there a bit more. So all of that said, we want to hear all your comments and all your input, regardless of, whether this is something we feel is in the legislative language or it's something that's coming in extra. So we will be entertaining all those comments as we move forward. Questions, Paul? I see your hand.
Yeah, so just trying to make sure I understand right. So the draft of the RFP was done by ADS, right? And
Yep, go ahead.
And it's substantially done. And the only real roadblock is, so my understanding is there's only 4 members of the task force that don't already have a vermont.gov email address. Would it not be acceptable to just print 4 copies of the draft and mail it certified mail, and we could have it within 2 days and be able to discuss it next Wednesday?
I don't know that I object to that. Tucker, do you see any concerns with that?
Sending it by mail to everyone?
Yeah.
No, I think it's gonna be marked as a draft. And sorry, I had to step off there for a second, but maybe there was some discussion, but my understanding is there's been some discussion that these draft RFPs are themselves non-public. So this would be the first document that you're receiving that would be considered non-public, since it's still in draft form and hasn't been published yet. But I don't see I don't see a problem with that. Since you adopted your confidentiality policy today, so you're kind of
right.
Right. I don't think certified mail is any less vulnerable than email.
Right. Right. That's probably true.
Or excuse me, or should I have said that wrong? More vulnerable than email.
Right.
what I meant.
Fortunately, none of
Um,
us lives in the town of Grand Isle where they no longer get mail distribution.
Right.
That is true. Why don't we do this? If I can get confirmation on how quickly the email addresses can be set up, and if they can be set up by, say, Friday.
Yep.
We could distribute that way. If not, we could go to the Plan B, Plan B being the distributing by mail.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay,
I'm good with that.
great. With all of that said, it would probably be a good idea for each of you to email Callie the address to which you would like these things to be sent, if we end up going that route, whether that's home or office or what have you. Okay. Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns from task force members on the RFP status and timeline? Okay. Hearing none, we will move now to public comment, or the rest of public comment, I guess we could say. If there's members of the public present who wish to comment and you're able to, you could raise your hand in the Teams application. Let's see, who do we have? It looks like Kim Cheney has dropped off. Mr. Sisk has dropped off. Stephen, do you have any additional public comment? Stephen, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. You could be muted. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so we will move off.
Yeah, it's
public-
because you
There we
muted
go.
me and I couldn't unmute myself from the telephone.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
All right, Stephen, go ahead.
A couple of things that the RFP, I'm glad that you realized you might need to revisit the confidentiality statement or policy, because you didn't address, unless you hire independent counsel, you didn't address the chronic problem with DPS lawyers stalling public records, using a Supreme Court decision that said that 3-day and 10-day deadlines in statute don't apply anymore. They're just advisory. And that has been abused by the DPS lawyers to such a gross degree that it would basically eviscerate public records law. This is going to be a fast-moving process, and it's going to need a lot of public engagement and scrutiny, which brings me to my next point. How does this public safety communications plan interface and integrate with the other telecommunications planning going on in Vermont? And that is, if you look at 30 VSA 202C for policy and goals, and 30 VSA 202D for the telecommunications plan, that's called the 10-year telecommunications plan. That process is a very transparent, publicly engaged process of preliminary drafts, public hearings, reviews, comments on the preliminary draft, responses from the department to comments on the preliminary draft, final draft, and then a joint committee hearing of the legislature to review and take testimony or take comments on the final draft and whether it should be adopted. In effect, the planning work that this task force is being forced to do by time urgency and dysfunction in other departments needs to follow that level of transparency and engagement. And you won't do it by locking down every detail in secrets and delays. You need to find a way to engage with the first responders who aren't going to be as sophisticated in either technology or policy, and really give them documents that they can review and understand. So that brings me to my second point, which is the role of the Emergency Communications Advisory Council. Now, that council was created by executive order probably 4 years ago, and it was never appointed. the people were the positions of that council taking over from the Public Safety Broadband Network Commission, which steered us into this FirstNet boondoggle, was never appointed. So we've done without an Emergency Communications Advisory Council or a vacant Emergency Communications Advisory Council for the last 4 years. Now, related, there is this 10-year telecommunications plan that I've just called your attention to. The new Vermont Community Broadband Board is writing its own plan called, referencing a federal program called BEAD, B-E-A-D. They have also created a middle mile fiber plan. All of this implicates how we're going to get connectivity to public safety radios and cellular transmitters. All of that requires resilient, redundant, self-healing rings of connectivity. There's the operability, statewide communications, emergency statewide interoperability plan that Department of Public Safety is responsible for. And the last one, I think, was done in 2018 or 19, and it had missing chapters referenced in bright red in the tables in the back. So what I'm recommending is that all the principals in government, that this task force take formal action and request that the executive order be revised to include all the parties from all these plans as an advisory council to inform and advise the work of this task force, and separately advise the Department of Public Service, which is responsible for the 10-year telecom plan. Ultimately, all these plans will be woven into one actionable and rapidly revisable plan. But we need to have the Radio Technology Services head from Public Safety on an advisory council. We need to have Hunter Thompson from the Department of Public Service, responsible for the 10-year telecom plan, on an advisory council. We need to have the National Guard, who does last resort emergency communications, on an advisory council. And basically everyone needs to lay their cards on the table, what their initiatives are, look for synergies, look for cost savings and opportunities to support the work of this task force. And the way to do that is to recommend that remodeling of the Emergency Communications Advisory Council to make sure that we've covered all of these different initiatives and make sure that the cellular infrastructure that's put in as a result of this task force planning meets not only the current but the future needs of VTrans and the Department Agency of Transportation for connectivity along the highways, not just for an emergency voice call, but for autonomous vehicles. So there's we're playing catch up. We're decades behind in integrated planning for telecommunications, and it's impacting our economy. It's impacting our resiliency, preparedness. Just one brief case in point, a cognitively disabled man was stranded in an apartment above the filling station at Bailey and West State Street, and the police had moved their dispatch operation up to Berlin Hill, and the administrative lines didn't transfer. So I spent over a day wading through water, trying to get through to the police to tell them to send a boat for that guy. And that's just one example, and I'm sure there are many. So I would ask you to put this on the agenda for the next meeting, and I've got some draft language and scope for that. This is not a new idea. It was proposed earlier. It's just never been acted upon. What else? The request for proposals needs to not be limited to the literal. It needs to be I still don't hear whether there's two requests for proposals, one for a project manager and one for all the subject matter expert inventories, et cetera. Originally, this legislation was conceived, I was instrumental in it, and it was conceived to have two RFPs and to allow project manager RFP to be selected first, awarded first, and then have that project manager involved in awarding the subsequent subject matter expert contracts. And I've heard no mention of that. I'm concerned that the task force has not yet gotten on its feet and is not engaging and is basically letting the administration, the two co-chairs and their, backroom staff to hand you a fait accompli, and that's not the way this is supposed to work. Y'all need to be deciding how many RFPs, who should be preparing, whose ideas, whose eyes should be on them for input, and make sure that if you get a faulty RFP out there, you're derailing the project from the get-go. So that's probably enough for now.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. And I did make note of several recommendations in your comments, and if you have them in writing, that would be helpful. And we appreciate your input. Any further public comment? I don't think we have any other members of the public here, but just in case. Okay. We are on to new business, which will include the setting of the next meeting date. Any new business from task force members?
I guess I have based on Stephen's comments, I do have a question, I guess. He brought up the idea of there being actually two RFPs, one for a project manager and one for subject matter experts. Can you give us a sneak preview of what is the draft RFP that we're going to be receiving, hopefully within the coming week? What are we actually looking for in that draft?
So the draft RFP that I've been speaking of today and has been being developed all along is more to the subject matter expertise, which would include project management from the vendor, which may be distinct. In fact, I think is distinct from project management for the task force, right? So I think what I will do is we'll get you a clear update. We'll put that on the agenda. I'll recommend to the commissioner that be a agenda item for next week to get that cleared up have that discussion about where we need to go with the project management piece of it as well. Anything else? Okay. Setting of a new meeting date. If I can be so bold, I would recommend we meet next Wednesday, the 26th at 11:15. That work for everyone?
Yep, that's good with me.
Okay.
That looks good for me.
Okay, good.
Send,
Thank you,
send that
Ron.
date back. What was the date again?
26th, Wednesday, the 26th at 11:15.
It may not work for me. I'll be traveling back from a conference.
Okay, I think we should pick a time that works for as many of us here on the call as possible. So let's, traveling back from a conference, so that kind of eliminates the day, the entire day of Wednesday.
We might be able to do it later. Is there another time that works? Maybe 1, 2?
I could do 2, or I could do the following day at either of those times.
I could do the following day, but I'm likely to be busy later on in that day.
Okay. What does the 27th look like for everyone? Say, just to keep things simple, I suppose we could say 11:15. I'm seeing nods. Yes. Okay. Ron, you said that will work for you as well?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. I'm going to hope that there's no conflict with the commissioner, because I think it'd be important for her to be here. But we will set the meeting, Callie, for September 27th at 11:15. if we are able to get all these RFPs distributed, or when we're able to get that too, that does allow us an extra day. So that may be good for a couple of reasons. Okay, so Thursday, September 27th at 11:15.
July 27.
I'm sorry, what did I
Yes.
say? September.
September.
Yeah, I guess July would
Getting
be
ahead of yourself.
better. Thank you. July would probably move the work along a little quicker. So sorry about that. I'm not quite sure where I got September. Anyway. Okay. Anything else from task force members? All right. I will take a motion to adjourn if we are at that
So
point.
moved. So moved.
Second.
Mayor moved. Michael, was that you seconding?
Sure.
Okay, okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Anyone opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you very much,
Good.
everybody.
Thank you,
We'll
Barb.
talk to you next
Thanks,
week.
Barb.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.